Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the world is no stranger to the CCP's aggression. As they increase hostilities against Taiwan and other allies in the region, it is abundantly clear that the CCP seeks to dominate the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Just look at their military activities around Taiwan, their harassment of the Philippine ships in the South China Sea, and their support for Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. The CCP's long history of subjugation extends beyond Asia. The CCP has a long and violent record of oppression against the people of Tibet. In October of 1950, Chinese communist troops annexed Tibet, slaughtering tens of thousands of innocent Tibetans and monks. The CCP's ongoing oppression of the people of Tibet ultimately forced the Dalai Lama to flee to India. This persecution has continued to this day. In November, the CCP released a white paper on its policies in Tibet. In this document, the party doubled down on its oppression and cracked down on religious and economic freedom of Tibetans. Some of the actions taken by the CCP include setting up boarding schools to re-educate, quote unquote, Tibetan children, clamping down on the use of Tibetan language, restricting movement of Tibetans, and even attempting to insert themselves into the succession of the Dalai Lama himself. This white paper demonstrates the need for this bill, and I'm proud to have co-introduced this with Representative McGovern. The promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act helps Tibetans in several ways. It pushes back against CCP propaganda about the history of Tibet. The United States has never accepted that Tibet was part of China since ancient times, as the CCP falsely claims. This legislation clarifies U.S. policy and highlights the unique language, religion, and culture of the Tibetan people. It directs U.S. diplomacy to push back against CCP propaganda. In addition, it ensures Tibetans have a say in their own future. This bill stresses the need for a dialogue between the CCP and other democratically elected leaders of Tibet. Any resolution must include the wishes and voice of the Tibetan people. Tibetans are a democracy-loving people who wish to practice their religion freely and have their own wishes and desires acknowledged. I'm proud to have played a small part in supporting this dream for the Tibetan people. I want to thank Senators Merkley and Young, who passed this bill unanimously through the Senate. And I encourage all my colleagues to push back against the CCP's oppression of the Tibetan people and vote in favor of this bill. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Speaker, I rise in strong support of Senate 138, promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, I rise in strong support of Senate 138, a Senate companion bill to the bipartisan House bill H.R. 533, which the House passed this February. My good friend from Massachusetts, Representative McGovern, and Chairman McCaul introduced H.R. 533, and I was proud to support its passage out of committee and on the floor last year. I'm glad the Senate has followed suit so we can get to this important legislation that addresses Beijing's severe ongoing repression of the Tibetan people and signed into law. For too long, Beijing has oppressed the Tibetan people and failed to honor its commitments to engage in meaningful dialogue with the Dalai Lama and his representatives regarding Tibet's future. I'm deeply concerned by Beijing's systematic efforts to erase the distant religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity of the Tibetan people. In a new effort to stamp out Tibetan identity, Beijing is closing local schools and uprooting children from their families by placing them in centralized Chinese boarding schools far from home. This is effectively preventing Tibetan parents and communities from passing down their language and heritage to the next generation. This forced assimilation has raised significant concerns for multiple UN special rapporteurs. They've warned that these residential schools function as a large-scale program designed to integrate Tibetans into dominant Han culture, violating international human rights. While Beijing employs these tactics to suppress Tibetan culture, it simultaneously propagates disinformation about Tibet and its history. H.R. 53 calls out Beijing's oppressive tactics and relentless disinformation campaign. This bill reinforces our unwavering support for the Tibetan cause and calls on PRC to engage in genuine dialogue with Tibetan representatives. It also strengthens the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002 by enhancing our public diplomacy efforts to counter PRC disinformation about Tibet. I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member of the House Rules Committee and the author of H.R. 533. Mr. McGovern.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of final passage of the Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act, legislation that I was proud to have authored. The House took the lead in considering this bill, passed it with an overwhelming majority last February, and sent it to the Senate. The Senate, in its wisdom, changed one paragraph, one. So the bill has come back to this chamber for final passage. I want to thank my incredible co-lead, Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman McCaul, and Ranking Member Meeks for bringing this bill to the floor and for all of their incredible advocacy on behalf of the Tibetan community. And I welcome the opportunity to shine a light on this legislation once more as we send it on its way to the President's desk. It has been more than 60 years since the People's Republic of China forced the 14th Dalai Lama into exile and took control of Tibet against the will of its people. The dispute between the Chinese and the Tibetans over governance of Tibet has persisted ever since, even though the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people have repeatedly expressed their willingness to engage in dialogue. Meanwhile, the PRC has done everything it can to erode Tibetan history, language, culture, and religion. In other words, to erase the Tibetans as a people. And this bill seeks to end that. One, by explicitly recognizing that the Tibetan people are a people with a distinct religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity. Two, by reminding everyone concerned that the Tibetan people have a right to self-determination under international human rights law. And three, by requiring the U.S. government to actively counter the PRC's propaganda about Tibet, like the false claim that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times, a position that the United States has never accepted. With this bill, we hope to restart dialogue between Tibet and China, in keeping with long-standing U.S. policy. Mr. Speaker, the world is awash in conflict, and at the heart of many conflicts lies this systematic denial of a people's human rights. And the decades-old dispute between Tibet and China started as an armed conflict of invasion, resistance, and insurgency. In the long run, the only guarantee against the resumption of violence is for the PRC to fully respect the human rights and dignity of the Tibetan people. A vote for this bill is a vote to recognize the rights of the Tibetan people, and it is a vote to insist on resolving the dispute between Tibet and the People's Republic of China peacefully, in accordance with international law, through dialogue and without preconditions. So I urge my colleagues to please join me and the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCaul, in sending these important messages in solidarity with the Tibetan people. And I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for yielding me the time, and I yield back.
I'd like to thank the gentleman. There's been no more determined or erstwhile supporter for the Tibetan people than Representative McGovern. I thank him for his efforts, long-standing efforts on their behalf, which is really our behalf as well as a country. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker, and I'm prepared to close after the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Gentleman reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With no more speakers, I'm prepared to close.
Recognized.
Speaker, for too long, the Tibetan people have suffered as Beijing systematically works to erase their religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity. The forced assimilation through centralized Chinese boarding schools and tearing children away from their families are beyond the pale. And it's a refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue with the Dalai Lama since 2010 that only highlights Beijing's blatant disregard for resolving the Tibetan question. This is an important and timely measure. I want to thank Senator Merkley, Representative McGovern, Chairman McCaul, and all those individuals for getting this bill to the finish line. I also want to extend my gratitude to Speaker Emirata Nancy Pelosi for her unwavering support of this bill and her principled conviction to hold the PRC accountable for its human rights violations. I hope my colleagues will join with all of us in supporting this important bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This body has always stood for the principles of free speech, independence, and individual liberty. I want to thank my dear friend, good friend, Mr. McGovern, for his efforts on this important legislation, as well as Ranking Member Meeks and Representative Bill Keating, who worked with me to advance this bipartisan bill. We are always strongest when we speak with one voice, as one nation in support of freedom and democracy. Tibet has a rich, peaceful heritage that the CCP attempted to erase when they invaded it in 1950. But they have failed. Their attempts to quash this vibrant history have failed because of the resilience of the Tibetan people. The U.S. strongly condemns all CCP oppression and coercion of Tibetans, as well as any CCP involvement in the secession of the Dalai Lama. Despite the CCP's attempts to erase the history and culture of Tibet over the last 70-plus years, it still remains vibrant, strong, and inspirational. Tibetans, like all people, have the right to religious freedom, which includes freedom from CCP surveillance, censorship, and detention. If the CCP truly does respect sovereignty, as it claims to, then they will engage in peaceful dialogue with the Tibetans to resolve this conflict, not force Tibet to accept a CCP proposal. Passing this bill demonstrates America's resolve that the CCP's status quo in Tibet is not acceptable. And I can think of no greater message or gift to the Dalai Lama and the people of Tibet than the swift passage of this bill to get to the President's desk as soon as possible to help put the people of Tibet in charge of their own future. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 138? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
On that, I request the yeas and the nays.
All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.